In this video, we're going to go over some problems for Chapter 1 to review for the first unit exam. First of all, we're going to look at data types. In this problem, we have some descriptions of the data, and we also can see what some of the data actually looks like. For each one of these three variables, we want to determine whether we have a categorical variable, one that's quantitative and continuous, or one that's quantitative and discrete. For the first one, which is temp, the body temperature is something that would actually be measured. It's going to be quantitative data, and if it's measured, that means it's going to be continuous. The next variable is sex. If we look at the description up here, this does have numbers, but they represent words. So a choice of either male or female. That means that this has to be a categorical variable. For the last variable, beats, this is the heart rate in beats per minute. This is a quantitative variable, and if we're trying to decide whether it's discrete or continuous, we look at whether it answers the question how many. It would in this case because it's answering how many beats per minute there are. Another way we could tell that is that the possible number of beats would be, for example, 64, or it could be 65, 66. But there's no way that you could have 64.5 beats. If there are gaps between the values, that means it has to be discrete. The next problem is similar. We're identifying whether the data is categorical, quantitative and continuous, or quantitative and discrete. If we have answers to a survey question where the answer choices are yes, no, and I don't know, anything that's words has to be categorical. The number of fish caught by each team during a fishing tournament, this would be quantitative. Then we need to decide whether it's continuous or discrete. Since it's talking about the number of fish, this would answer the question how many. That means it's discrete. For the weights of fish caught during a fishing tournament, this is also quantitative. This time the weights are something that is measured. That means it's quantitative and continuous. Last of all, student ID numbers. Although these are numbers, because they're just identifiers, this would be categorical data. One other way that you can tell whether numerical values are categorical or quantitative is think about what would happen if you did a mathematical operation with these. For example, if you tried to find the average of the student ID numbers, would that mean anything or not? In this case, it wouldn't mean anything to have an average of all the student ID numbers. The next question is about finding the population and the sample. In this question, the Gallup organization surveyed 18 undergraduates who were attending a college and living outside the United States. When we're looking at what population was represented, we want to look at the characteristics that were chosen for the sample. First of all, they were undergraduates, they were attending a college, and they were living outside the United States. Those are the three characteristics that we were told. That would be the population that is represented by this study. So our population would be all undergraduates who were attending a college and living outside the US. All we did was to put all at the beginning of this, and then we just listed those characteristics. For the sample, this is the people who actually participated in the study. And we were told there were 1,800 of them, so that's what our sample was. In this question, a public opinion survey was conducted among 2,000 adult citizens in the United States, and 56% of them were in favor of gun control. To find the population represented in this survey, again, we're going to look at the characteristics of the individuals in the sample. That was, they were adult citizens in the United States. So our population would be all adult citizens in the United States. The sample would be the 2,000 citizens who were actually surveyed. Then we also have this 56%. The next question asks if that's a statistic or a parameter. Because this came from the sample, that makes it a statistic. If it had come from an entire population, then it would be a parameter. In this question, a market researcher is asked to study customer service for a grocery store. She plans to survey store customers as part of the study, and she needs to obtain a sample that is representative of the store's customers. She wants to try different sampling methods and compare the results. We have 5 different plans here. For each one, we're going to determine whether it's a stratified sample, a systematic sample, a cluster sample, a simple random sample, a convenience sample, or a voluntary response sample. For the first one, we're going to take a particular week and split it into 21 time periods, so morning, afternoon, and evening for each of the 7 days of the week. 7 of the time periods will be randomly selected, and during those times, all the customers in the store will be surveyed. Since we're splitting the week up into time periods, that means that we're splitting the customers up into groups. We're randomly selecting some of those groups, and we're taking all of the customers in those groups. That makes this a cluster sample. So the way we could tell it was a cluster sample was that we were dividing our population into groups, and then we were selecting entire groups to be in the sample. For Plan B, a day will be selected, and when the store opens at 7 a.m. on that day, every customer that walks in will be asked to complete the survey until there are 100 completed surveys. In this one, there is no suggestion of anything that's random. They're just doing what's the easiest possible thing to get 100 completed surveys. That means that this is a convenience sample. And remember that a convenience sample is not a valid sampling method, so this would not give us a valid sample if we were trying to do a study. For Plan C, this time the cash registers will be programmed to flag every 50th customer at the checkout for an entire week. Each flagged customer will be surveyed. In this one, since they're going to survey every 50th customer, that makes this a systematic sample. Remember, systematic is where you have some type of a list and you take every nth individual on the list. In this case, it's every 50th customer. In Plan D, cash register receipts will include an invitation to fill out an online survey. In this one, because the customers have a choice whether to fill out the survey or not, that makes it a voluntary response sample. This also is not a valid sampling method because the customers that are likely to go to the trouble to fill out the online survey are going to be ones with strong opinions about the store, especially the ones that had a bad experience there. They might fill out the survey if they had a really great experience, but most of the people who were in the middle aren't going to go to the trouble to fill out the survey. For Plan E, we take one particular week and survey 20 customers each day. The customers each day will be randomly selected. Since this time we're splitting the week up into 7 days and taking a certain number of customers from each one of those 7 days, that makes this a stratified sample. Remember that the difference between a cluster sample and a stratified sample, although for both of them you are dividing the population into groups, for a stratified sample you are taking some individuals from each one of the groups. Whereas with the cluster sample, we actually selected groups and took everyone that was in that group. The next question involves a study of the effectiveness of Echinacea on upper respiratory tract infections. In this one, some of the children with the infections were given Echinacea, and some of the children were given placebos. The question is whether this was an observational study or an experiment. This would be an experiment because 2 different treatments were applied in order to try and change whether the children recovered faster from the upper respiratory tract infection or not. So this is an experiment because a treatment was applied. If no treatment had been applied and the researchers had just observed the children, if they hadn't given them Echinacea and just observed them, then it would be an observational study. The other thing that it doesn't tell us in this is whether single blinding or double blinding was used in the study. So let's look at the difference between the two in a study like this. If we had single blinding, that means that the children involved in the study wouldn't have known which of the 2 treatments they were receiving, whether they were receiving the Echinacea or the placebo. but the nurses responsible for giving the treatment would have known which treatment they were giving. In this case, the children wouldn't know which treatment they had, but the people giving the treatment would have known. If it's a double-blind study, then neither one of them would know. The children wouldn't know, and the providers wouldn't know either. Most of the time in studies like this, they do use double blinding, because if the provider does know which treatment they're giving, they can actually introduce bias into the study that way.